They forced her onto the last train out of town, and the only man who could have stopped it chose to stand still, as if watching her leave was part of the plan. The platform smelled of coal smoke and hot iron, the kind that clung to your throat and stayed there long after the train was gone. Ethan Cole didn't move, not when Clara Whitmore's gloved hand slipped against the metal railing, not when her father's men stepped back like their job was done, and not when the conductor called out final boarding. In a voice that carried no sympathy, just routine, Ethan stood at the far end of the platform, boots planted in the dust, hat pulled low the brim, cutting a hard line across his eyes. From a distance, he looked like any other cowboy passing through, but everyone in that town knew better. They knew he could have walked forward, said one word, maybe just her name, and everything might have changed, but he didn't, and that silence spread faster than whispers through the crowd. People began to shift their weight, glance at each other the way they do when they're watching something they don't fully understand. Clara didn't cry, she didn't beg, she didn't look back. Right away, she stepped up into that train like someone stepping into a life. She didn't choose the hem of her dress brushing against the steel edge, her hand gripping the door frame just a second longer than needed. And then she turned just once. Her eyes found Ethan across the distance, and in that moment the noise of the station seemed to fall away. No engines, no voices, no wind, just that look, steady, unbroken, asking something. Without words, Ethan's jaw tightened, almost too slight to see. His hand hovered near his side, not his gun, not reaching, just there, like he was holding himself in place. The conductor gave a short nod, the door slammed shut with a sound that echoed too loud, and the train began to move slow at first, wheels grinding against the track, then faster, pulling her away inch by inch. The town watched, expecting something, a shout, a step forward, a mistake, but Ethan didn't give them that. He stayed exactly where he was until the last car passed, until the red lantern at the end disappeared into the dust, and only then did he lift his eyes fully to the empty track and exhale like a man who had just made a choice no one else could see. The platform emptied slower than it should have, like the town itself was unsure whether to breathe again after what it had just witnessed. A few men lingered near the ticket office, speaking in low voices, their hats tipped just enough to hide the unease in their eyes, because something about the way Ethan Cole had stood there did not sit right with them. It was not weakness, it was not fear, it was something quieter, something heavier. Ethan turned at last, boots grinding softly against the dirt as he stepped off the wooden planks of the platform. The sound of his spurs was the only thing that followed him down the road. No one called his name, no one tried to stop him, because out here a man who chose silence usually had his reasons, and most folks knew better than to ask too many questions. The wind carried the fading whistle of the train across the open land, a long hollow sound that stretched miles before breaking apart into nothing. Ethan did not look back, not at the tracks, not at the people, not at the place where Clara Whitmore had stood just minutes ago. Instead, he walked toward the far edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the land opened into dry grass and scattered fence lines. His horse waited where he had left it, tied loosely to a post. The animal shifted as he approached, sensing the change in him, not panic, not anger, just something settled. Something decided. Ethan rested a hand on the saddle for a moment longer than needed, his fingers tracing the worn leather, like he was confirming something real, something already done 3 days earlier under a sky that looked no different from this one. He had stood inside the Whitmore office, where polished wood and clean glass tried to make power look respectable. Papers spread across the desk, names written in ink that carried more weight than any bullet. Ethan had not raised his voice, had not made threats. He had simply placed something on that desk, something Henry Whitmore had not expected. A document older than the town itself, signed in a hand that could not be questioned. It had taken years to find and a lifetime to understand what it meant. When Henry read it, his confidence had slipped just enough to show the truth behind it all. Ownership was never what it seemed. Control was only as strong as the paper that claimed it. And that paper had changed hands before the train ever touched the tracks. Back in the present, Ethan pulled himself into the saddle. The leather creaked beneath his weight, familiar, steady, the kind of sound that did not ask questions. He turned the horse away from town, not toward the tracks, not toward the direction the train had taken, but somewhere else, somewhere ahead where the dust had not settled yet. Because Ethan Cole had never been a man who chased what was taken. He was the kind who made sure it could not be taken again. And far down the line, where the train would stop for water and silence, Clara Whitmore was about to learn that leaving did not always mean losing, and that sometimes the man who stayed behind was the only one who had already moved. The train did not slow for nearly 30 miles, and when it finally did, the world outside the window looked nothing like the one Clara Whitmore had left behind. The buildings were smaller, the platform narrower, the people fewer and quieter, like a place that did not ask questions because it already knew enough. Clara stepped down carefully, her boots touching unfamiliar ground, while the last of the steam drifted past her in slow white clouds. She carried nothing but a small case and the weight of everything she had not been allowed to say. The conductor gave her a brief glance, not unkind, just distant, the way men look at travelers they will never see again. And then he turned back to his work, leaving her alone with the sound of the engine settling into silence. The air smelled different here, less coal, more dust, and sun-warmed. Would she took a step forward, then another, not sure where she was meant to go, only certain that going back was no longer an option. Behind her, the train released one final hiss before moving again, the wheels picking up rhythm as it pulled away, leaving the platform emptier than before. Clara watched it for a moment longer than she intended, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her case, not from fear, but from the strange feeling that something had already been decided without her consent. A man stood near the far end of the platform, not dressed like a townsman, not quite a worker either. His coat was plain, but clean, his posture straight, as if he had been waiting not for the train, but for her specifically. He did not approach right away. Instead, he studied her the way someone reads a letter. Before deciding whether to open it, Clara noticed him. After a few steps, her gaze steady, not cautious, just aware, because she had learned quickly that in places like this attention was its own kind of currency. The man tipped his hat slightly, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, then reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was thick, the kind used for documents that mattered more than words alone. He crossed the distance between them with measured steps, each one unhurried, until he stood just close enough to offer the envelope. Without speaking, Clara did not take it immediately. Her eyes moved from the envelope to his face, searching for something familiar, something that would explain why a stranger would be holding her future in his hand. There was nothing obvious, no name, no recognition, only certainty. Finally, she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper before closing around it. The weight surprised her, not heavy, but deliberate, like it carried more than ink. The man spoke, then his voice calm, and even the way people speak when they know they are delivering something that cannot be undone. He said, "This was left for you, Miss Whitmore." And that was all. No explanation, no questions, just the simple passing of something from one life to another. Clara looked down at the envelope, her name written in a hand she recognized immediately, not because she had seen it often, but because she had paid attention the first time. Ethan Cole did not write like other men. His letters were steady, deliberate, each line placed with intention, as if even ink had consequences. She felt something shift inside her, not hope, not yet, but something close to understanding. The man stepped back, giving her space, the platform quiet again, as if the moment itself was waiting. Clara broke the seal slowly, the paper inside unfolding with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have. Her eyes moved across the lines once, then again, slower this time. The words were simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. Ownership transfer, land title, reassignment, legal authority, confirmed everything that had once belonged to Henry Whitmore now stood under her name, not borrowed, not promised, but hers. The wind stirred lightly, lifting a strand of her hair across her face, but she did not move to fix it. She stood there reading the same lines over again until the meaning settled fully into place. And far away, where the tracks cut through open land, Ethan Cole rode, without hurry, because he already knew the exact moment she would understand. Clara did not fold the paper right away. She held it there in both hands, as if letting it breathe, as if the truth written across it needed a moment to settle into the world around her. The wind shifted again, softer, this time carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke, the kind of quiet place where no one rushed and nothing demanded explanation. She lifted her eyes slowly from the page and looked out across the small town. The buildings stood low and worn, but steady, like they had been there long before anyone cared about names like Whitmore or Cole. The man who had handed her the envelope remained a few steps back, not watching her anymore, but not leaving either, as if his role was not finished. Yet Clara finally folded the document with care, each crease deliberate, her fingers no longer trembling, because something inside her had changed. Not relief, not exactly, but a release from something she had carried too long. Without realizing it, she stepped off the platform onto the packed dirt road, the sound of her boots quieter than she expected, almost as if the ground itself was willing to let her pass. Without question, the man spoke. Again, his voice, still calm, still measured. There is a property about half a mile west of here, he said. Small house, fenced land, water. While still running, it has been prepared. Clara turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the words prepared. She repeated softly the word, unfamiliar in this context because nothing in her life had ever been prepared for her. Without expectation attached, the man nodded once, only once, and then added, he made sure of it. There was no need to ask who he meant. The answer had been written already in ink and silence in the space between what was taken and what was given. Clara looked down at the case in her hand, then back toward the road stretching west. The horizon open wide, no gates, no guards, no expectations tied to her name, just distance and choice. She began to walk, not fast, not hesitant, just steady, each step placing her further from the version of herself that had stood on that platform hours earlier. The sun hung lower, now casting long shadows across the ground. Her shadow moved beside her, not behind, not ahead, but equal, like something finally aligned after being pulled in the wrong direction for too long. After a few steps, the man turned and walked away in the opposite direction, his part finished, without needing thanks, without needing to be remembered, because some things were not meant to stay, only to arrive. Clara continued alone, the road quiet beneath her boots, until the town behind her faded into nothing more than a suggestion in the distance. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the reach of tracks and expectations, Ethan Cole slowed his horse near a ridge overlooking open land. He did not need to see her to know where she was or what she had read. He rested his hand lightly on the saddle horn, his gaze fixed ahead, not searching, not waiting, just measuring distance the way a man does when he knows exactly how far something important has already traveled. And for the first time since the train had left the station, Ethan allowed himself a breath that was not held back, because some distances were not meant to be closed right away. Some were meant to be earned, one quiet mile at a time. The house stood where the man had said it would, just past a bend in the road where the land dipped slightly, and the wind moved slower, like it had decided to rest there for a while. Clara saw it before she reached it, a small structure with weathered wood and a porch that leaned just enough to show age, but not weakness. A fence stretched around the property, not new, but repaired in places with care. The gate hung straight, the hinges quiet. As she pushed it open with one hand, her case still in the other, the ground inside felt different, firmer, as if someone had walked it recently, not often, but enough to keep it from being forgotten. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes moving across every detail. The well stood to the left, rope coiled neatly beside it, a bucket resting against the post, clean, not abandoned. The door to the house was closed, but not locked. She could tell from the way it sat in the frame, not forced, not sealed, just waiting. Clara set her case down on the porch before reaching for the handle. Her fingers paused for a brief second, not from fear, but from the weight of what opening that door might mean. Not a return, not a continuation, something else entirely. She pushed it open. The hinges gave a soft sound, nothing sharp, nothing broken, just the kind of noise that comes from use and time. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of wood and sunlight. The room was simple, a table near the window, two chairs, one of them slightly worn on the back, as if someone had leaned there, often a stove in the corner, cold but clean, a bed against the far wall, neatly made with a blanket folded at the edge. Everything was in place, not decorated, not personal, but prepared just enough to be lived in. Clara stepped inside, her boots quiet on the wooden floor. She moved slowly, not exploring, not searching, just taking in what had been left for her on the table. Something small caught her eye, a folded piece of cloth beside it, a tin cup, and a single key. She walked over, her fingers brushing the surface of the table before picking up the cloth. It was a handkerchief, plain white, but carefully folded. Beneath it, the key lay, still catching the light from the window. Clara held it between her fingers, turning it slightly, not for the door she had just opened. Something else, something further, perhaps a place she had not yet seen. Her gaze shifted to the window outside. The land stretched open, the fence marking its boundary, but not limiting its space beyond it. Fields waited, untouched, not empty, just quiet, like they had been waiting for someone who knew how to see them, not for what they were, but for what they could become. Clara set the key back down gently, then unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small piece of paper, not sealed, not hidden, just placed where it would be found. She read the single line written there, the same steady hand, the same deliberate ink. Start where you stand. She let the words settle, not instructions, not command, just a truth offered without expectation. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing against the walls of the house, soft and steady, and far beyond the reach of that quiet place. Ethan Cole rode along the ridge, the horizon wide in front of him, he did not look back, because he knew she would not need him to not, yet some things had to be built without being watched, some steps had to be taken alone, and for the first time, since he had stepped onto that platform, he allowed himself to believe that she would take. Then morning came, without ceremony, the light slipping through the thin curtains in slow, quiet lines that stretched across the wooden floor. Clara woke before the sun had fully settled into the sky, not because she had to, but because something inside her no longer allowed her to sleep through the start of a day that belonged entirely to her. She lay still for a moment, listening not to noise, but to the absence of it. No footsteps outside, no voices calling her name, no doors opening without permission. Just the soft movement of wind against the walls and the distant sound of something small moving through the grass. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling back as her feet touched the floor. The wood cool, but steady beneath her. She moved through the room, without hesitation, now each step more certain than the last, as if the space had already begun to recognize her. She paused by the table, where the key still rested exactly where she had left it, catching the early light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She picked it up this time, without delay, turning it once between her fingers before closing her hand around it, not questioning, not wondering, just accepting that whatever it opened was meant to be found. She stepped outside, the air sharper in the morning, carrying a faint chill that brushed against her skin, but did not slow her. The land stretched out in front of her wide and open, the fence line marking a boundary, but not a limit. She moved toward the far side of the property, where the ground dipped slightly, the grass thinner there, worn down by something that had passed through more than once, and then she saw it, a smaller structure set back from the house, partially hidden by the curve of the land, not abandoned, but not obvious either. Its door closed tight, the wood darker from weather and time. She approached it slowly, her steps measured, not cautious, but aware, because some things deserve to be approached with intention. She reached the door and paused, her hand resting against the surface, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers before bringing the key forward. It fit, without resistance, the turn smooth, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The lock released with a quiet click, nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just a simple acceptance. She opened the door and stepped inside. The space was dim at first, the light from outside stretching in behind her, revealing shapes. Gradually, a workbench along one wall, tools arranged not randomly, but with care, a shelf holding small items wrapped and stored, each one placed as if it mattered more than its size suggested. And then she saw it on the far side of the room, a wooden chest, not large, not ornate, just solid, resting on the floor where it could not be missed. Clara moved toward it, her breath steady, her hand reaching out to lift the lid. It opened without effort, and inside lay something she had not expected, not gold, not money, not anything that could be measured in simple value, but letters, several of them bound together with a thin strip of cloth, each one addressed in the same familiar hand, her name written clearly across the top, Clara Whitmore. She did not open them, not yet. She held them, instead feeling the weight of something that had taken time, something that had been written not in a moment, but over many and far beyond that quiet place where the morning had begun. Ethan Cole rode along a narrow path, the sun rising at his back, casting his shadow long across the ground. He did not slow, he did not turn, because some things once set in motion did not need to be watched, they needed to be trusted, and for the first time he allowed that trust to settle fully into place, knowing that when she opened those letters, she would not just understand what he had done, she would understand why. Clara stood in the doorway of the small structure for a long moment, the letters still in her hands, the morning light now stronger behind her, stretching across the floor and touching the edge of the wooden chest like it was pointing to something that had been waiting longer than she had known. She stepped back outside, slowly, the air warmer, now carrying the promise of a day that would not pause for reflection. But she did not rush. She walked back toward the house, each step measured, the letters held carefully against her chest, not hidden, not exposed, just carried the way something important is carried when it is not ready to be shared with the world. She reached the porch and sat down on the top step, the wood firm beneath her, grounding her in a place that was beginning to feel less unfamiliar and more like something she could claim. Her fingers moved to the cloth, binding the letters, hesitating just slightly before loosening it. The fabric slipped away easily, revealing the first envelope beneath it, her name written again in that same steady hand, not hurried, not decorative, just clear, as if each letter had been placed with intention. Clara drew a breath and opened the first one. The paper inside unfolded softly, the sound small but final like the beginning of something that could not be undone. She began to read the words, simple at first, almost distant, not declarations, not explanations, just moments written down as they had happened a morning by the fence line, where he had seen her for the first time, not as Henry Whitmore daughter, not as someone out of reach, but as someone standing alone in a way that felt familiar, a detail. She had not remembered the way she had paused before speaking, as if choosing her words carefully, even when no one had asked her to. Clara felt her chest tighten. Slightly, not from pain, but from recognition, because these were not grand gestures, they were small observations, the kind people only notice when they are paying attention. She turned to the next letter, then the next, each one revealing something different, not about what he had done, but about what he had seen, the way she held herself. When others expected her to shrink, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she never once asked for help, even when it was clear she had needed it. The words were not heavy, they did not try to convince, they simply existed, steady and quiet. And because of that, they carried more weight than anything spoken aloud. Clara lowered the letters into her lap, her gaze lifting out toward the open land beyond the fence. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves, catching the sunlight in a way that made the field look alive, not empty, not waiting, just present. She understood, then not all at once, but enough to feel the shift, that what he had given her was not just land, not just freedom from a name that had defined her. It was something harder to accept, something that required more than gratitude. It was trust, not the kind that asks for something in return, but the kind that steps back and allows the other person to choose their own path, without interference. And far beyond the quiet of that place, Ethan Cole slowed his horse near a shallow stream, the water moving steadily over smooth stones. He dismounted, letting the reins fall loose as the horse lowered its head to drink. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking down at the water, not seeing his reflection, not searching for answers, just allowing the silence to settle, because he knew that somewhere behind him, miles away, Clara Whitmore was reading words he had never expected to be understood. And for the first time, he did not wonder if she would come looking for him. He wondered only if she would choose to keep walking forward, even if he was not there to see it. Clara did not rush to open the rest of the letters. Instead, she gathered them carefully and placed them back on the table inside the house, not hidden, not displayed, just there where she could return to them when the moment felt right. Because for the first time in her life, she understood that not everything needed to be consumed all at once. Some things were meant to unfold slowly, like the land outside her window. She stepped back onto the porch, the sun, now higher, casting a warm, steady light across the field. The air carried a different kind of stillness, not empty, not waiting, just settled. Clara moved down the steps and walked toward the fence, her hand brushing lightly along the wood. As she passed each post, the texture rough beneath her fingers, but strong, repaired where it needed to be, but never replaced entirely, as if whoever had worked on it believed that strength came from what it already endured. She reached the gate and paused, her eyes scanning the stretch of land beyond it, rolling gently outward, the grass shifting in quiet patterns under the wind. She stepped through, not because she had to, but because she could. The ground beyond felt no different, and yet everything about it did. She walked without direction at first, just letting her feet carry her forward until the house behind her became smaller, not distant, but no longer defining the space she occupied. A bird lifted from the grass nearby, startled by her movement, its wings cutting briefly through the silence before settling again somewhere further out. Clara stopped and looked down at the earth beneath her boots, dry, but not lifeless, the kind of soil that would respond if someone chose to work it, not demand, but respond. She crouched slightly, her hand reaching down to touch it. The dust clung lightly to her skin, grounding her in a way that felt unfamiliar, but right. She did not wipe it away. She let it stay, rising again. She turned slowly, taking in the horizon, the absence of walls, the absence of expectation, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to feel the quiet settle fully around her, because this was not something she had been given. This was something she had been allowed to claim, and that difference mattered more than anything written on paper. Far from that open field, Ethan Cole rode through a narrow path, the path winding between low hills, the sun now high enough to cast no shadows ahead of him, only beneath him, keeping him anchored to the ground. His pace had not changed, steady, unhurried, the way a man rides when he is not chasing or being chased, but simply moving towards something that does not need to be named. He reached a ridge and slowed, bringing the horse to a stop. The land opened wide below him, stretching farther than sight could easily measure. He looked out across it, not searching for a figure, not expecting to see her there, because that was never the point. His hand rested lightly against the saddle, the leather warm under the sun, his expression unchanged, but something in the stillness of him had shifted. Not tension, not waiting, just a quiet certainty that what had been set in motion no longer needed his hand to guide it. And somewhere miles behind him, Clara Whitmore stood in the middle of land that no longer belonged to her past. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing alone. The afternoon stretched long across the land, and Clara did not return to the house right away. She remained where she stood, letting the quiet settle deeper into her bones, not as an absence, but as a presence, something that filled the space where noise used to live. The wind shifted again, brushing past her shoulders, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth, and something greener beneath it, a promise not yet visible, but close. She turned slowly, her gaze tracing the outline of the fence in the distance, then back, toward the house, its shape smaller now, but steady, unchanged, as if it had been waiting for her long before she had ever known to look for it. She began to walk back, this time, not drifting, not uncertain. Her steps followed a line that had not been there before, not a path worn into the ground, but something internal, something chosen. When she reached the porch, she paused again, not out of hesitation, but to notice the way the light had shifted, the shadows shorter, now the warmth stronger, the day moving forward whether she acted or not. And that thought settled something inside her. She stepped into the house and went straight to the table where the letters rested. Her hand moved over them lightly, not opening another one, yet instead she picked up the tin cup and carried it to the well outside. The rope slid easily through her fingers as she lowered the bucket, the sound of it meeting water soft and distant. She pulled it back up, the weight real in her hands, the effort steady. She poured the water into the cup and drank slowly, the coolness sharp against the heat of the day, grounding her further in the moment. When she finished, she did not set the cup down right away. She held it there, looking out across the land again, but this time she was not observing. She was considering. The fence needed mending in places, the field needed clearing, the house needed fire by nightfall. These were not burdens, they were beginnings. She set the cup down and moved with purpose, now gathering what little she had seen in the shed earlier, tools placed where they could be reached. Without searching, she worked without rush, but without pause either, her hands learning the weight of each motion, the rhythm of something honest, something that responded directly to effort without expectation attached. And as the sun lowered slowly toward the horizon, the first change became visible, not in the land, but in her posture. The way she moved, no longer like someone placed somewhere, but like someone who had arrived, and far beyond the line where her land met the open distance. Ethan Cole rode along a quiet stretch of trail, the sky beginning to shift into evening light, gold fading into something deeper. He slowed again, not because he needed to, but because something in him recognized the same shift happening miles away. Without seeing it, he knew she had stepped forward, not because she was told to, not because she was guided, but because she had chosen to. And that knowledge settled into him like the end of a long-held breath, not relief, not satisfaction, just a quiet understanding that what he had left behind had not been lost, it had taken root. And somewhere between the fading light and the coming night, neither of them needed to look back to know exactly where they stood. The light began to fade, slowly stretching shadows across the field as Clara worked, the rhythm of her hands steady, now familiar, the wood of the fence rough against her palms as she secured another loose section, not perfectly aligned, not flawless, but strong enough to stand. And that was enough. She stepped back slightly, looking at what she had done, not with pride, not yet, but with recognition. Something had changed, not just in the land, but in her. The air cooled as the sun dipped lower, the sky turning from gold to a deeper shade that softened everything it touched. She wiped her hands lightly against her dress, leaving faint traces of dust that she did not bother to brush away, because they no longer felt out of place. She moved back toward the house, her steps slower now, the day settling behind her like something completed, not finished, but begun. Inside the room, the quiet felt different, not empty, but earned. She crossed to the table where the letters still waited, her hand hovering above them, before finally choosing another one, not the first, not the last, just the next. She opened it carefully, the paper unfolding with the same quiet sound, and began to read. This one was different, not about what he had seen, but about what he had not said. Moments where silence had been chosen, not out of fear, but out of respect. To time when he had watched her stand against her father's expectations without raising her voice, the way she had held her ground, without asking for anyone to stand with her. The words did not praise, they did not explain, they simply acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, Clara felt something settle deeper than before, because this was not about being saved, it was about being seen. She lowered the letter slowly, her eyes lifting toward the window where the last light of day rested against the horizon, and for the first time, she understood why he had not stepped forward on that platform, not because he could not, but because he knew she needed more than a moment of defiance. She needed a life that was hers without being tied to his action, without being defined by his choice. The realization did not come with anger or regret, it came with clarity, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. She folded the letter and placed it back with the others, her hand resting on them for a brief moment before letting go. Outside, the first hint of night began to settle, the air cooler now, the sounds softer. As the world prepared to rest, Clara stepped out onto the porch again, the sky wide above her filled with the quiet promise of stars not yet visible, but already there. She stood still, her gaze steady, not searching, not waiting, just present in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. And far beyond the reach of that quiet place, Ethan Cole rode beneath the same darkening sky, his path guided only by what lay ahead, the land stretching out without end. He did not slow, he did not stop, because he understood now that what mattered was no longer behind him, and for the first time since he had turned away from that platform, he allowed the silence to remain unbroken, knowing that somewhere miles away, Clara Whitmore no longer needed it to be night settled fully, but it did not bring darkness the way it used to. The small house held a quiet warmth now, the kind that came not from fire alone, but from presence, from use, from a life beginning to take shape. Clara moved inside after a long moment beneath the open sky, her steps unhurried, her mind clear in a way that felt new, not empty, not burdened, just steady. She lit the lamp on the table, the soft glow spreading across the room, touching the edges of the letters still resting where she had left them. The light did not demand attention, it offered it. And this time, she accepted. She sat down and reached for another letter, not because she needed answers, but because she understood now that what was written inside them was not meant to guide her forward, it was meant to show her where she had already been. She opened it slowly, the paper familiar beneath her fingers, the words inside quieter than the ones before, fewer lines, more space between them, as if each one had been chosen carefully and then left alone long enough to matter. He wrote about the day he realized she would never ask him to stay. He described the way she had looked past him once, not dismissing, not ignoring, but choosing something else, something beyond what either of them could name. At the time he wrote that, it was the moment he understood that whatever stood between them was not distance, it was direction, and direction could not be forced. Clara read the line twice, then lowered the paper slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the reflection of the lamp flickered faintly against the glass. She could see herself there, not clearly, not fully, but enough to recognize the difference. She was no longer the woman waiting for permission to choose, she was the one who had already chosen, and the weight of that did not press down on her, it lifted something away. She folded the letter, carefully placing it back with the others, her hand resting on them for a brief moment before pulling away, not holding on, not letting go, just acknowledging that they were part of something that had already done its work. Outside, the wind moved gently against the walls, the sound soft, almost like a breath, and for the first time since arriving, Clara did not feel the need to fill the silence. She let it remain, because it no longer felt like something to escape, it felt like something to stand within. She rose from the table and moved toward the door, stepping out onto the porch once more, the night air cool against her skin, the sky wide and clear above her filled with stars that did not ask to be noticed, they simply existed. She looked out across the land, the faint outline of the fence barely visible now, but still there, still holding its shape in the dark. And in that moment, she understood that what had been given to her was not just a place, it was a beginning that required nothing more than her willingness to continue, and far beyond the reach of that quiet land. Ethan Cole slowed his horse beneath the same sky, the stars stretching above him. Without end, he brought the horse to a stop, and for the first time in days, he did not look ahead. He looked up, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged, but something within him had settled, not because he expected anything in return, but because he knew that somewhere out there Clara Whitmore was no longer standing at the edge of something, she was already inside it, and that was enough. Morning returned again, but this time it did not feel like something new, it felt like something continued. Clara stepped outside before the sun fully rose, the air cool and still, the kind of quiet that held everything in place before the day began to move. She stood on the porch for a moment, her eyes tracing the edges of the land, not searching, not measuring, just recognizing what was already hers. The fence stood where she had left it, the repairs holding firm, not perfect, but enough. And that word had begun to change its meaning for her. Enough was no longer something small. It was something real. She stepped down onto the ground and moved toward the well again, her hands steady as she drew water, the motion now familiar, the weight expected. She poured it into the tin cup and drank slowly, the cold cutting clean through the last traces of sleep, her gaze lifting as she swallowed, not toward the house, not toward the fence, but beyond it, toward the open stretch of land that had once felt distant and now felt like something waiting for her to decide. She set the cup down and did not return it to the table. Instead, she carried it with her as she walked out past the fence line again, the gate swinging closed behind her with a soft sound that did not echo. She moved further, this time her steps more direct, until she reached the point where the ground shifted slightly, where the grass thinned and the soil beneath showed through. She crouched again, her fingers pressing into it, feeling the texture, the resistance, the quiet promise beneath the surface. She stayed there longer than before, not thinking, not planning, just allowing the moment to settle into something that felt certain. When she stood again, she did not look back toward the house right away. She looked forward toward a line that did not exist yet, but could. She began to walk along it slowly, placing each step with intention, not marking the ground, but marking something within herself, a direction not chosen for her, not given, but claimed. The sun rose higher, now casting light across the land in long, steady lines, and as it did, the shape of the place began to change, not physically but in the way it was seen. The space no longer felt open in a way that suggested emptiness. It felt open in a way that allowed for movement, for choice, for growth, and Clara Whitmore stood in the center of it, no longer as someone who had arrived, but as someone who had begun, and far beyond the reach of that quiet land. Ethan Cole rode along a distant ridge, the morning light catching the edges of his path, his pace unchanged, his direction steady. He did not look back, because there was nothing behind him that required his attention. What mattered now was not what he had left, or even what he had given, it was what had been set in motion. And for the first time since he had turned away from that platform, he allowed the thought to settle fully into place that some things were never meant to be held onto. They were meant to be given the space to become something more. And somewhere miles behind him, Clara no longer needed a reason to stay. She had already chosen to. The days did not announce themselves anymore. They simply arrived, and Clara moved within them, as if she had always known how. Morning found her already outside, her hands steady on the fence line where new wood met old, not replacing but reinforcing. The wind moved across the field, carrying the scent of turned soil, now darker in places where she had begun to work. The land responded not with ease, but with honesty, each step forward asking for effort, and returning it in kind. She paused at the edge of the field, the horizon stretching wide in front of her, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, just there waiting. Without pressure, she wiped her hands slowly against her dress, the marks of work no longer something to hide, but something to recognize. She turned toward the house, the small shape holding its place against the open land, not as shelter alone, but as something that had begun to belong to her in a way no title ever had. She stepped onto the porch and reached for the letters again, not to read them all, not to search for more, but to take one and carry it with her. She did not open it. Instead, she folded it once and slipped it into the pocket of her dress, the paper resting there, not as a reminder, but as something carried forward. Without needing to be seen, she stepped back down and moved across the yard, her path clear now, not because it had been shown to her, but because she had walked it enough times to make it real. The gate opened and closed behind her with the same quiet sound, and she continued past it without hesitation. The sun sat higher, now the light stronger, casting no shadows ahead of her, only beneath her, keeping her grounded. With every step, she walked until the house behind her became part of the land, not separate, not distant, just one piece of something larger. She stopped finally, not because she had reached an end, but because she understood. There was no end to reach, only a place to stand and continue from. She looked out across the field, the fence, the horizon, all of it held together by something simple and steady. Her breath came slow, even, not held, not forced, just present. And in that moment, she did not think about what had been taken from her or what had been given. She thought only about what she would build with what remained, and far beyond the stretch of that quiet land, Ethan Cole rode along a distant trail, the sky wide above him. The same sky that stretched over her, though miles stood between them. His pace slowed, not from weariness, but from something quieter, something settled. He reached a rise in the land and brought the horse to a stop, his gaze moving out across the distance, not searching, not expecting, just aware. He did not turn back. He did not change direction. He simply remained there for a moment longer, then needed, his hand resting lightly on the saddle, the leather warm beneath the sun, and then he moved on the path ahead, open and unmarked, because some stories did not end with two people standing side by side. They ended with both of them standing where they were meant to be, and out here, that was enough. Out here, justice did not need a witness, and love did not need a promise. It only needed two people strong enough to let each other go and brave enough to keep walking forward.